Hello, everyone. My name is Anne-Marie Fisher-Hertzman, and I'm here presenting on the grammar translation method. I speak pretty fast, so I'll try to speak a little bit slower. The definition is that the grammar translation method is a method of teaching foreign languages derived from the classical method of teaching Greek or Latin in the early 1500s. According to Brown and Lee, which are the authors of our primary text, the classical method was teacher centered with memorization of grammatical rules and vocabulary, translations of text, and written exercises. This can be found on page 17. It was the classical method that evolved into the grammar translation method in the late 19th century. In this era, language was studied purely as an academic discipline. The grammar translation method is one of the methods, therefore, that constitutes the early years in the teaching of languages that we have read about in our primary text. In grammar translation classes, students learn grammatical rules and then apply those rules by translating sentences between the target language and the native language. There are several features or characteristics of the grammar translation method, and I'll go through them right now. Number one, the grammar translation method, it represents a teacher-centered approach. What exactly do I mean by that? It is teacher-directed. For example, the teacher is a controller of the language acquisition in the classroom. Therefore, the teacher does most of the talking, transmits the knowledge. Usually, students hear our views as empty vessels, having little or relevant prior knowledge. The teacher tells the major concepts in the curriculum, and the teacher's lesson plan drive what is taught for the day. Therefore, the students are merely receivers of the knowledge. For this, number two, there is a great emphasis on memorization of grammatical rules, explaining of rules, memorization of vocabularies, and translation of reading passages and also their written exercises that are really part of the classroom daily. Reading is given with almost exclusive focus here, with related grammatical analysis. There is number four, a classical assumption that education is viewed as a discipline. Therefore, the classroom is usually quite strict in terms of its operations. As we said before, that is run and managed by the teacher. Number five, in this method, the learning of a foreign language is the mark of educated persons. Hence, there is a focus on translation of passages in this sort of rudimentary setting or approach. The translation of passages and reading proficiency enables students to read and translate literature written in the source language and to further students' general intellectual development. And here the source language is the second language or the language that is actually being taught or learned by the student. Classes are usually taught in the student's native language. And number eight, the translation exercises is usually from language two, the foreign language, to language one, the native language, which is actually performed. The strength of the grammar translation methods include number one, reading proficiency. Students who engage in grammar translation methods are able to read well in the language two or the second language, as with all the emphasis and translations and grammar exercises, this help their actual development. Also, learners usually become familiar with the written form of language. Again, based on the emphasis on translation of the passages and reading proficiency. As well, there is also emphasis on mother tongue mirroring, meaning that there's an adaptation of word for word translation in this form of language education. So students are usually able to grasp the language, over time because of this rudimentary, if you will, approach where there is this emphasis on grammar, emphasis on translation, and also emphasis on essential reading. Learners usually develop a strong ability in grammar of the learned language or language too. But what are the weaknesses? Usually, in this form of translation method, there is no oral practice or fluency. This is because little or no attention is given to the oral development. Number two, there's a great reliance on memorization. And so a lot of the classes are spent with students memorizing the grammatical code, memorizing the verbs, memorizing the nouns. And so that is a great emphasis in the class. All of this constitutes another level of weakness is the rigid environment or structure of this sort of academic, if you will, very stiff classroom. Number four, the studies have shown that for this grammar translation method, there is no research that has undergird or legitimizes it. And so, as we said it earlier, it's one of the early times in the 1900s, and it was developed then and has been used from then. But there's no research that has actually proven its legitimacy, if you will. Number five, because of that, the final weakness is that there's a rejection of the method by some linguistic scholars because they viewed it as having no theoretical basis. That is a part of the weaknesses. An example of an activity using the grammar translation method is my own learning of Spanish in high school. And this is a long time ago, some 20 years ago at Clarendon College in Jamaica. In the first form, which is about grade 9, usually students are introduced to Spanish, which is the second language of Jamaica. From reading about this grammar exercise and just thinking about my own induction, if you will, into a second language, I remember the process of learning Spanish it was very academic, very teacher centered. Our Spanish teacher's name was Mr. Douglas, who was a language master. He was the only one who spoke Spanish, who understood it, and myself and my colleagues at age 13 were just primarily, learners sitting there. He would walk in the classroom, greeted us in Spanish, drilled us in Spanish. Spanish sentences would be written on the chalkboard, and we were asked over time to translate or to answer the questions. Some of the phrases that I still remember some 30 years after include, and forgive me because my Spanish is terrible, there was no emphasis on the oral aspect, so I could be saying this really wrong, but this is what I remembered. So they'll say, ¿Cómo se llama usted? I remember that means, what is your name? And my response, or our responses then, or mine would be, Me llamo Anne Marie. My name is Anne Marie. I also remember, ¿Dónde vive usted? Where do you live? And I'll respond like, Vivo en Ajax. I live in Ajax. I also remembered, ¿Cómo estás? How are you? And the response we were taught, and I still remembered, is muy bien, gracias. Fine, thank you. I also remembered time was a major thing, so ¿Qué hora es? What time is it? I will not tell you what time it is right now as I'm doing this presentation. I also remember that there was an emphasis on masculine and feminine representation of individuals. And I realized, remember, as a young teenager, I was somewhat fascinated. And so I remember little boy was Nino, little girl was Nina, son was Ijo, daughter was Ija, aunt was Tio, and uncle, sorry, no, aunt was Tia, and uncle was Tio. So I always remember that the masculine had the O at the end and the feminine had the A at the end of that particular noun. We were given passages to read and translate usually in the classes. Exercises were also given to test our memory and how well we have learned the lesson. After over 30 years, I still have a little memory of the Spanish language, even though I've never been immersed in a Spanish cultural environment. So, as noted above, the legacy of memorization is still very much embedded in my brain, and it's really a great strength of the grammar translation exercise. Overall, and finally, I want to say grammar translation method, even though there is no sort of academic work that proves its vitality or legitimacy, I want to say I think it still withstood attempts to turn the 20th century to reform the language teaching methodology. And this is from our textbook. It is practiced in a lot of educational context. And in the textbook, Teaching by Principles and Interactive Approach to Language and Pedagogy, Brown and Lee state that until this day, it, meaning grammar translation method, is practiced in too many educational contexts. I was surprised that they said too many. I'm not sure. It seems as if they're not essentially for it. But undoubtedly, really is that this method will continue to be a cornerstone in terms of language teaching. I've used it in my years as learning language in high school, and there is some legitimacy to it. After over 30 years, I still remember some basic things. And so there is a longevity for a grammar translation method, and I think it will be around, I want to say forever, as long as individuals are learning languages, because it is really one of those fundamental approach. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this presentation.